The billionaire married his doctor without love, until one night her touch destroyed his control. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Cassian Vale sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, his steel-gray eyes scanning quarterly reports with the same precision that had built Vale Pharmaceuticals into a global empire. At 38, he had perfected the art of emotional distance. Every handshake calculated, every smile measured, every decision filtered through logic alone. The 12 board members around him spoke in hushed tones about genetic research breakthroughs and patent acquisitions, their voices blending into a familiar symphony of corporate ambition. Then the room tilted. The sensation started as a whisper, a slight tremor in his left hand as he reached for his coffee. Cassian's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Control was everything. Control had gotten him here, to this glass tower overlooking Manhattan, to this life where emotions were liabilities and vulnerability was a currency he refused to spend. Mr. Vale, the Geneva facility is reporting exceptional progress on the neurological compounds. Harrison Webb, his chief financial officer, continued presenting. Oblivious to the war Cassian was fighting against his own body. The tremor spread to his chest. His heartbeat became irregular, erratic, like an old engine refusing to find its rhythm. Cassian's breathing grew shallow, but his expression remained unchanged. A mask of composure he'd worn so long it felt permanently etched into his features. "Sir, your thoughts on expanding the Swiss operations?" Cassian opened his mouth to respond, but the words felt heavy, foreign. The room's corners began to blur, and for the first time in decades, something scared him. He wasn't in control. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside, "let's reconvene tomorrow. I have some considerations to review." The board members exchanged glances but didn't question him. They never questioned Cassian Vale. He stood, his movements deliberate and measured, and walked to his private office. Only when the door clicked shut did he allow himself to lean against the wall, his palm flat against the cool glass window. Below, Manhattan pulsed with life, millions of people moving through their routines, unaware that 20 floors above, a man who controlled their medications, their treatments, their hope for healing, was quietly falling apart. His assistant, Beverly, knocked softly. "Mr. Vale? Dr. Morrison is here for your annual physical." Cassian straightened. Dr. Morrison had been his physician for 8 years, discreet, efficient, uninterested in small talk. "Perfect. Send him in." "Doctor." Morrison entered with his usual brisk professionalism, black bag in hand. "Cassian, how are we feeling today?" "Fine," Cassian replied, settling behind his desk as if nothing had happened. "Let's make this quick." But as Dr. Morrison checked his blood pressure, Cassian saw something shift in the older man's expression. The reading, the second reading, the third. "Cassian, when did you last take a real vacation?" "Vacations are for people who don't enjoy their work." "And when did you last sleep more than 4 hours consecutively?" Cassian's silence was answer enough. Dr. Morrison set down his stethoscope and looked directly at him. "Your body is shutting down. Blood pressure through the roof, heart rhythm irregular, stress hormones at dangerous levels. This isn't just exhaustion. This is a complete systemic breakdown. Prescribe whatever you need to prescribe." "I'm not prescribing anything. I'm prescribing someone." Cassian's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "You need constant monitoring, someone who understands both medicine and discretion, someone who can manage your health without disrupting your image. I don't need a babysitter. You need a doctor, a specific kind of doctor." Dr. Morrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts. "Dr. Sylvie Ashford, clinical medicine with specialization in behavioral health. She's worked with high-profile clients who need medical care without media attention. Brilliant, ethical, and completely uninterested in anything but results." Cassian studied the name on the phone screen. Something about it felt different from the usual parade of specialists who had tried to fix various aspects of his life. "She'll need full access to your routine, your home, your schedule," Dr. Morrison continued. "Think of it as a medical investment. You invest in companies. Now invest in the only asset that actually matters, your ability to stay alive long enough to enjoy what you've built." For a moment, Cassian saw himself through Dr. Morrison's eyes, a man who had spent so long building walls that he'd forgotten to leave himself a way out. "Fine, but she follows my rules." Dr. Morrison smiled grimly as he packed his equipment. Something tells me Dr. Ashford has her own rules, Cassian, and maybe that's exactly what you need. As the door closed behind Dr. Morrison, Cassian stared out at the city again. Somewhere out there was a woman who would soon have access to the life he'd spent decades perfecting in solitude. He reached for his phone to cancel the arrangement, but his hand trembled again, just enough to remind him that for the first time in his adult life he wasn't the one in control. And something deep inside him wondered if that might be the most terrifying thing of all. She had learned to read people in the spaces between their words, and Cassian Vale's silence spoke volumes. Dr. Sylvie Ashford stood in the marble foyer of Vale's penthouse, her medical bag at her feet, and her eyes taking in the pristine environment with clinical detachment. At 31, she had perfected the art of professional invisibility, arriving when needed, observing what others missed, and leaving without disturbing the careful equilibrium of her clients' lives. The penthouse was exactly what she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture that looked more like museum pieces than places where humans actually lived, and not a single personal photograph in sight. Everything was controlled, curated, emotionless. It was like standing inside someone's perfectly constructed armor. Dr. Ashford, Cassian's voice came from behind her, deep and measured. She turned and immediately understood why Dr. Morrison had called her personally. Cassian Vale looked like a man at war with himself, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but there were telltale signs of strain around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and too much caffeine. Mr. Vale. She extended her hand for a professional shake, noting the slight tremor he tried to conceal. Dr. Morrison briefed me on your situation. I understand you need discreet medical monitoring. His handshake was firm, controlled, but she felt the elevated pulse through his wrist. Let's be clear about something, Dr. Ashford. This arrangement is temporary. I don't need fixing. I need maintenance. Sylvie almost smiled. She'd heard variations of this speech from executives, politicians, celebrities, people who had convinced themselves that needing help was a sign of weakness rather than wisdom. I don't fix people, Mr. Vale. I monitor medical conditions and provide recommendations based on data. Nothing more, nothing less. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she hadn't tried to reassure him or coddle his ego. Good. He gestured toward the living area. Let's discuss terms. As they settled into chairs that felt more like architectural statements than furniture, Sylvie opened her medical bag and retrieved a tablet. I'll need access to your complete medical history, your daily schedule, dietary habits, sleep patterns, and stress triggers. I'll also need to monitor you at regular intervals throughout the day. Define regular intervals. Every 4 hours initially. Blood pressure, pulse, stress markers. Non-invasive but consistent. Cassian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She caught it anyway. You have a problem with being monitored? I have a problem with disruption. Sylvie set down her tablet and looked at him directly. In her experience, the most successful treatment came from establishing boundaries early, not just medical ones, but personal ones. Mr. Vale, I've worked with CEOs who run multinational corporations, politicians who make decisions affecting millions, surgeons who hold lives in their hands. They all have one thing in common. They're terrified that taking care of themselves will somehow diminish their ability to take care of everything else. Cassian leaned back slightly, studying her. And what's your professional opinion on that fear? That it's statistically backward. Neglecting your health doesn't make you stronger. It makes you a liability to everything you've built. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something crack in his carefully maintained composure. Not much, just a slight relaxation in his posture, as if he'd been holding his breath and finally allowed himself to exhale. Doctor, Morrison mentioned you specialize in behavioral health. I do. Physical symptoms often have psychological roots. Chronic stress, control issues, perfectionism. They manifest in measurable ways. Elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep cycles, cardiovascular strain. And you think I have control issues? Sylvie glanced around the immaculate penthouse, then back at him. I think you've built a life where everything is predictable, except the one thing that matters most, whether your body will cooperate with your plans. The observation hit its mark. She could see it in the way his fingers tensed against the chair arm, the way his breathing shifted almost imperceptibly. What do you need from me? He asked finally. Honesty. If you're experiencing symptoms, tell me. If you're not sleeping, tell me. If something triggers stress, tell me. I can only help with what I can measure. And I can only measure what you're willing to acknowledge. Cassian nodded slowly. And what do I get in return? Your life, probably extended by several decades if we address this properly. They sat in silence for a moment, and Sylvie found herself studying his face. There was something almost vulnerable about the way he was considering her words, as if part of him wanted to trust her, while another part was calculating the risks. There's one more thing, she said, reaching for her medical kit. I'd like to do a baseline assessment now. Heart rate, blood pressure, stress indicators. It'll only take a few minutes. Cassian hesitated, and in that hesitation Sylvie glimpsed something she hadn't expected: fear, not of the medical procedure but of what it might reveal, of what it might mean to let someone this close to the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. All right, he said, finally rolling up his sleeve. As Sylvie wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, she noticed the way he held himself completely still, as if movement might betray something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Her fingers brushed his wrist as she positioned the stethoscope, and she felt him tense at the contact. Relax, she said softly, not looking at his face. This works better if you don't fight it. But as the numbers appeared on her monitor, Sylvie realized that fighting might be the only thing keeping Cassian Vale alive, and learning to stop might be the very thing that could save him. 3 days into their arrangement, Cassian realized that Dr. Sylvie Ashford was quietly dismantling his entire existence. It started with small things. She appeared at precisely 6:47 a.m. for his first checkup. Not 6:45, not 7, but 6:47, as if she had calculated the exact moment his body would be most honest about its condition. She worked silently, efficiently, recording numbers on her tablet while he sat stiffly in his kitchen chair, trying to pretend that having someone witness his morning vulnerability wasn't slowly unraveling him. Your cortisol levels are still elevated, she said on the third morning, removing the blood pressure cuff with practiced precision. Are you sleeping? I sleep. How much? Cassian reached for his coffee. Black, no sugar. The same way he'd been drinking it for 15 years. Enough. Sylvie made a note on her tablet. She didn't push, didn't lecture, didn't offer unsolicited advice. Somehow her silence felt more invasive than questions would have. I'm scheduling your next check for 10:30, she said, packing her equipment. Try to eat something substantial before then. Your blood sugar is inconsistent. After she left, Cassian stood in his kitchen, a monument to unused appliances and takeout containers, and found himself looking at the cabinet where he kept cereal. When was the last time he'd eaten breakfast that didn't come from a coffee shop or a boardroom caterer? He couldn't remember. By 10:30, he had managed half a bowl of oatmeal and was feeling absurdly proud of this minor domestic accomplishment when Sylvie returned. She noticed the empty bowl in the sink immediately. Better, she said, and something in her tone made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with stress. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not surprised, I'm encouraged. She sat across from him at the breakfast bar, her medical equipment spread between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. Your blood pressure is down 3 points from this morning. Cassian watched her work, noting the way she handled each instrument with the same careful attention he reserved for million-dollar deals. There was something mesmerizing about her focus, the way she seemed to exist entirely in the present moment. Dr. Ashford, Sylvie, she corrected without looking up. We're going to be doing this for a while. Formality is exhausting for both of us. Sylvie. The name felt strange in his mouth, too personal for someone who was supposed to be just another professional service provider. Sylvie, he repeated. Can I ask you something? She glanced up, and he was struck again by how direct her gaze was. No practiced charm, no social maneuvering, just honest attention. Why did you agree to this arrangement? Doctor, Morrison said you usually work with politicians and celebrities. I imagine they're more cooperative than I am. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around her eyes. Honestly, because you're the first client who didn't try to charm me during the consultation. Most people find charm effective. Most people aren't treating someone whose job is to see through facades. She capped her pen and looked at him directly. You didn't pretend to be interested in getting better. You didn't make promises about lifestyle changes you had no intention of keeping. You were just honest about not wanting help. And that appealed to you? It told me you might actually be ready for help, even if you don't know it yet. Cassian felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. You think I need help? I think you've spent so long taking care of everyone else's needs, shareholders, employees, the global pharmaceutical market, that you've forgotten how to recognize your own. The observation hit too close to something he'd been avoiding for years. He stood abruptly, moving to the window where Manhattan stretched out below them, busy and anonymous and safely distant. My needs are simple. Make money, maintain control, stay alive long enough to do both effectively. And what about connection? The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Connection is a luxury I can't afford, or a necessity you've been afraid to acknowledge. Cassian turned to face her, and found her watching him with that same clinical attention she brought to reading his vital signs. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like compassion. You don't know anything about my life, Sylvie. I know you live in a penthouse designed for entertaining that shows no evidence anyone has ever been entertained here. I know you have a kitchen that could serve 20 people, and you eat takeout alone. I know you've built an empire helping other people heal, and you're slowly killing yourself in the process. Her words cut through him with surgical precision, exposing truths he'd spent years carefully concealing even from himself. Maybe, he said quietly. That's exactly the way I want it. Sylvie packed her equipment in silence, but just before she left, she paused at the door. Cassian? He looked up. Wanting to be alone and needing to be alone are two very different things. I'll see you at 2:30. By the end of the first week, Cassian began to anticipate the soft knock on his door at exactly 6:47 a.m. He told himself it was because routine was important for maintaining control. He told himself Sylvie's presence was merely a necessary disruption, like scheduled maintenance on expensive machinery. He told himself many things, but none of them explained why he had started brewing enough coffee for 2 people, or why he found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps in his hallway. Your resting heart rate is improving, Sylvie said, unwrapping the blood pressure cuff from his arm. It was Thursday morning, and she had developed the habit of speaking to him in quiet, measured tones during these early sessions, as if she understood that his defenses were thinnest in those first moments after waking. Good, he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure why it mattered to him that she seemed pleased. And you've been eating breakfast. You've been monitoring my trash. I've been monitoring your glucose levels. They tell their own story. Cassian watched her record numbers on her tablet, noting the way her fingers moved across the screen with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. There was something calming about her competence, the way she inhabited her expertise without needing to prove it. Sylvie, yesterday when you mentioned connection, he paused, surprised by his own willingness to continue the conversation they'd started the day before. What did you mean exactly? She looked up from her tablet and he caught something unguarded in her expression before she composed herself. Human beings are biologically wired for social bonds. When those bonds are absent or damaged, it creates measurable physiological stress, elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep patterns, compromised immune function. So connection is medical? Connection is survival. The simplicity of her answer unsettled him. I've survived just fine without it. Have you? She capped her pen and studied his face with that clinical attention he was beginning to recognize. When did you last have a conversation that wasn't about work? Cassian opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The silence stretched between them, filling with the weight of an answer he couldn't provide. When did you last laugh? She continued softly. I'm not particularly funny. Neither am I. But laughter isn't about being funny. It's about letting go of control long enough to be surprised by joy. Surprised by joy. The phrase echoed in his mind long after she had packed her equipment and left for her next appointment. That afternoon, during their 2:30 session, something shifted. Sylvie arrived to find him sitting at his desk, staring at a phone that had been ringing repeatedly. Problem? She asked, setting up her blood pressure monitor with practiced efficiency. My brother. Cassian's voice was flat, emotionless. He calls every few months to ask for money, then disappears until the next crisis. And you don't answer? I stopped answering 2 years ago. Sylvie wrapped the cuff around his arm, and he noticed that her touch lingered a fraction longer than necessary. What kind of crises? The expensive kind. Bad investments, worse relationships, children he didn't plan for with women he didn't stay with. Sounds complicated. Sounds irresponsible. The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw Sylvie's eyebrows raise slightly. I learned a long time ago that enabling someone else's chaos doesn't help anyone, and refusing to engage helps. Cassian felt something defensive rise in his chest. It helps me maintain boundaries, or it helps you avoid feeling responsible for someone else's pain. The observation cut deep, touching something raw he'd buried beneath years of justified distance. "You don't know anything about my brother." "You're right, I don't." Sylvie checked his blood pressure reading and made a note, her expression carefully neutral. "But I know your stress levels spike every time that phone rings," which suggests that avoiding him isn't actually protecting you from anything. The phone rang again, as if summoned by their conversation. Cassian stared at the display, Fletcher calling, and felt his jaw clench involuntarily. "Your choice," Sylvie said quietly, but she didn't move to leave. Cassian looked at her, this woman who had somehow become a witness to his unraveling, and made a decision that surprised them both. He answered the phone. "Fletcher." "Cass. Jesus, I was starting to think you'd died or something." Fletcher's voice was too loud, too jovial, carrying the forced cheer of someone who needed something. "How's the pharmaceutical empire treating you?" "What do you need, Fletcher?" A pause. Then quieter. "Look, I know we haven't talked in a while, but I'm in a tight spot. Josie's pregnant again and the landlord is threatening eviction and—" "How much?" 20,000, maybe 25, just to get us back on our feet, you know? I've got this business opportunity in Denver that's practically guaranteed to." Cassian closed his eyes. The same script, the same desperate optimism, the same inevitable disappointment. "Fletcher, I can't keep doing this. Come on, Cass. You're loaded. This is nothing to you. It's not about the money. Then what is it about?" Cassian glanced at Sylvie, who was watching him with that steady, unreadable expression. "What was it about?" "It's about you never calling unless you need something. It's about you having 3 kids with women whose names I don't even know. It's about you thinking that, because I have money, I don't have limits." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Cassian wondered if Fletcher had hung up. "You know what, Cass?" Fletcher's voice, when it came back, was different, smaller, more honest. "You're right. I do only call when I need something. But that's because every other time I've tried to call, you make it pretty clear that you don't want to hear from me unless there's a crisis." The words hit Cassian like a physical blow because they were true. The silence after Fletcher hung up felt like falling through empty space. Cassian sat holding the phone, staring at the black screen as if it might offer some explanation for the hollow ache spreading through his chest. Across from him, Sylvie remained perfectly still, her medical equipment forgotten on the desk between them. "How long since you last saw him?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 years. Maybe 5. Cassian set the phone down with deliberate care. "He came to New York for our father's funeral, stayed 2 days, borrowed $3,000 and disappeared again. And before that, Christmas, maybe 7 years ago, he brought a girlfriend, Melissa, I think, and her kid from another relationship. The kid had pneumonia and Fletcher didn't have insurance." Sylvie's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. "So you paid for the treatment?" "Of course I paid for it. What was I supposed to do, let a child suffer because her mother made poor choices?" The words came out sharp, defensive, but even as he spoke them, Cassian heard the contradiction. "Fletcher thanked me by stealing my father's watch before he left." "Did you confront him?" "I changed the locks." Sylvie was quiet for a long moment, and Cassian found himself studying her face, looking for judgment that never came. Instead, she reached for her blood pressure cuff with the same gentle efficiency she'd shown all week. "Your blood pressure is elevated," she said, after taking the reading. "Not dangerously, but enough to notice. Talking to Fletcher has that effect. Talking to Fletcher or acknowledging that you miss him." The observation landed like a physical blow. Cassian stood abruptly, moving to the window where Manhattan spread out below. Millions of people living their complicated, messy lives without requiring his approval or management. "I don't miss the drama. I don't miss the late-night calls asking me to fix whatever disaster he's created this week. I don't miss being treated like an ATM with a heartbeat. But you miss your brother." Cassian's reflection in the window looked back at him. Successful, composed, utterly alone. "Fletcher stopped being my brother the day he decided I was more useful as a bank than as family." "And when did you decide the same thing about him?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because they both knew the answer. Somewhere along the way, Cassian had stopped seeing Fletcher as a person and started seeing him as a problem to be solved or avoided. When had that happened? When Fletcher dropped out of college? When he got arrested for drunk driving? When he called crying about his first bankruptcy? "It's easier," Cassian said finally. "Disappointing people is harder than avoiding them entirely." "Easier for who?" "For everyone." Sylvie stood and moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her soap, something clean and uncomplicated that reminded him of rain. "Can I tell you something about my work?" she said, her voice soft. "The clients who scare me most aren't the ones having panic attacks or breaking down in my office. They're the ones like you, people who have become so good at managing everyone else's expectations that they've forgotten how to have any of their own." Cassian turned to look at her, and was surprised by the sadness in her eyes. "You want to know what I think happened with Fletcher?" She continued. "I think somewhere along the way you both decided it was safer to play roles than to be brothers. He plays the screw-up who needs saving. You play the successful one who's above needing anything. And now you're both trapped in a script neither of you knows how to rewrite. Some scripts can't be rewritten. Some scripts need to be burned and started over." They stood together in the growing afternoon light, and Cassian found himself wondering when he had last stood this close to another person without an agenda, without a transaction, without needing to maintain some carefully constructed version of himself. "Sylvie?" "Yes?" "Why did you become a doctor?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before. "My sister was sick for 3 years before she died. Leukemia. The doctors were brilliant. They understood every cell count, every treatment protocol, every statistical probability. But none of them understood that what she needed most wasn't just medical care. She needed someone to see her as a person, not just a collection of symptoms." Cassian felt something shift in his understanding of the woman beside him. "How old was she?" 26. 3 years younger than me." Sylvie's voice was steady, professional, but he caught the slight tremor in her hands. "I became a doctor because I wanted to be the person who sees the whole patient, but I specialized in behavioral health because I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can treat is someone's loneliness." The confession hung between them, honest and raw and more intimate than anything Cassian had shared with another human being in years. "Is that what you think you're treating with me? Loneliness?" Sylvie turned to face him fully, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw something vulnerable in her expression. "I think you're so afraid of being disappointed by people that you've convinced yourself you don't need them. But your body tells a different story, Cassian. Every elevated heart rate, every sleepless night, every stress response, they're all asking for the same thing. What's that? Connection. The kind that doesn't require you to be perfect first." Something had changed between them, and Cassian felt it in every interaction that followed. It started with small things. The way Sylvie lingered an extra moment after completing his morning assessment, her fingers warm against his wrist as she counted his pulse. The way he found himself asking questions that had nothing to do with his medical condition, about her coffee preferences, about the book she was reading during breaks, about whether she missed working in a traditional hospital setting. "You're stalling," she said on Tuesday morning, week 2, as he took an unusually long time rolling up his sleeve for the blood pressure cuff. "I'm preparing. For a routine procedure you've done 12 times? Cassian looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something dangerous stir in his chest. Sylvie had tied her dark hair back in a simple ponytail, and there was a small coffee stain on her white coat that she probably didn't know was there. She looked real in a way that made his carefully controlled world feel suddenly artificial. "Sylvie." "Yes?" "What you said yesterday, about connection without perfection." He paused, surprised by his own willingness to continue this conversation. "Do you actually believe that's possible?" She wrapped the cuff around his arm with practiced efficiency, but he caught the slight hesitation in her movements. "For most people? Yes. But not for everyone. Not for people who've spent their entire lives believing that being needed is the same thing as being loved." The observation hit too close to home. Cassian closed his eyes as she inflated the cuff, focusing on the familiar pressure around his arm rather than the unfamiliar pressure building in his chest. "And what about people who've spent their entire lives believing that needing someone makes them weak? That's a harder pattern to break," she said quietly, "but not impossible." When she removed the cuff, her fingers brushed against his forearm, a contact that should have been purely professional, but felt charged with something electric. Cassian opened his eyes to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your blood pressure is normal," she said, but her voice was softer than usual. "Good. Your pulse is elevated. Is that a problem?" Sylvie's gaze held his for a moment longer than necessary. "That depends on what's causing it." The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Cassian felt himself leaning slightly forward, drawn by something he didn't want to name, when Sylvie's phone buzzed with an incoming text. She glanced at the screen and immediately stepped back, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I need to take this," she said, moving toward the window. "It's about a patient." Cassian watched her walk away, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Whatever the text said, it wasn't good news. "Dr. Pembroke?" Sylvie's voice was carefully controlled, but he caught the slight tremor underneath. "Yes, I received your message about Mrs. Chen." Mrs. Chen. Cassian found himself listening despite knowing he shouldn't, drawn by the change in Sylvie's tone, from the warm professionalism she used with him to something more clinical, more guarded. "I understand that the insurance is denying coverage, but that doesn't change the fact that she needs continued treatment." A pause, longer this time. "No, I cannot recommend discontinuing care simply because the family can't afford to pay out of pocket." Cassian felt something shift inside him as he listened to Sylvie advocate for a patient who couldn't advocate for herself. This was what he'd built his empire on, making medications accessible, ensuring that financial barriers didn't prevent people from getting the care they needed. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what it looked like when someone fought those battles one patient at a time. "I'll cover the difference myself if necessary," Sylvie said, her voice firm despite the slight shake in her hands. "Mrs. Chen has been making progress, and abandoning treatment now would be unconscionable." She ended the call and stood with her back to him for a moment, composing herself. When she turned around, her professional mask was firmly in place, but Cassian had already seen what lay beneath it. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Fine. Just a scheduling conflict." "Sylvie." She looked at him, and he saw the exact moment she realized he'd overheard more than she intended. "It's nothing I can't handle," she said quickly. "How much?" "I'm sorry? How much does Mrs. Chen need for her treatment?" Sylvie's eyes widened. "Cassian, you can't just— I can do whatever I want with my money." "How much?" $8,000. Maybe 10, depending on how long the treatment cycle runs. She shook her head. "But that's not your responsibility. Mrs. Chen isn't your patient." "No, but you are." The words came out before he could stop them, and they both knew he didn't mean in the medical sense. Sylvie stared at him, something vulnerable flickering across her features. "You don't understand. If I let you pay for Mrs. Chen's treatment, it changes things between us." "What things?" "The balance, the professional distance, the fact that I'm supposed to be taking care of you, not the other way around." Cassian stood and moved toward her, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. "What if I don't want professional distance anymore? Cassian, what if I'm tired of every relationship in my life being a transaction? This is a transaction. I'm your doctor. Are you? Or are you the first person in years who's made me feel like being human might not be such a dangerous thing?" They were standing close now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to feel the slight tremor in her breath. "This is exactly why doctors aren't supposed to get personally involved with their patients," she whispered. "Too late," he said, his voice rough with honesty. "I'm already involved." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sylvie stepped back first, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her medical bag. "I should go," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Should you?" Cassian remained exactly where he was, close enough that the space between them felt charged with possibility. "Or do you want to?" "What I want isn't relevant. I have a professional responsibility." "To whom?" "To me. Because I'm telling you that what I need right now has nothing to do with blood pressure monitors, and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in years, I don't feel completely alone in my own life." Sylvie's composure cracked, just slightly. "Cassian, you don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me." She set down her bag and looked at him with an expression that was part frustration, part longing. "You're asking me to risk my career, my reputation, my professional ethics for what? For something that might not even be real? What makes you think it's not real?" "Because you're isolated, vulnerable, and I'm the first person you've allowed close to you in years. It's called transference and it's textbook psychology." Cassian felt something cold settle in his chest. "So, what I'm feeling is just a psychological condition?" "I don't know what you're feeling." Sylvie's voice was barely above a whisper. "But I know what I'm feeling, and it's not professional anymore." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. They stood in the afternoon light filtering through his penthouse windows, two people who had spent their lives maintaining careful control, suddenly faced with something neither could manage or predict. "Sylvie, I need to leave," she said quickly, reaching for her equipment. "We can discuss adjusting the monitoring schedule when we've both had time to think clearly. But before she could gather her things, Cassian's phone rang. The display showed Harrison Webb, CFO, and something in Cassian's expression must have warned Sylvie that this wasn't a call he could ignore. Harrison? Cassian, we have a problem. The Wall Street Journal is running a story tomorrow about the Shanghai facility investigation. The board is meeting in an hour and they want answers about your stability. Cassian closed his eyes. The Shanghai facility, a pharmaceutical plant that had been under investigation for quality control issues that had nothing to do with Vale Pharmaceuticals directly, but enough to raise questions about the entire industry. What kind of answers? The kind that involve you appearing stable, reliable, and completely in control of your personal and professional life. Maxwell Chen from The Times called asking about your health, your mental state, whether the company is prepared for leadership changes. Maxwell Chen. Cassian felt the walls of his carefully constructed world pressing in around him. What did you tell him? That you're in excellent health and fully engaged with company operations. But Cassian, if there's any truth to the rumors about stress-related medical issues, you need to get ahead of this story. Cassian looked at Sylvie, who had frozen with her medical bag half-packed, clearly understanding that she was witnessing something significant. There are no medical issues, Harrison. Then prove it. The board wants assurance that you're not going to collapse in the middle of the biggest crisis we've faced in 10 years. After Cassian hung up, the silence in the penthouse felt deafening. A scandal? Sylvie asked quietly. A potential scandal? The kind that could cost me controlling interest in my own company if the board decides I'm not fit to handle the crisis. Cassian moved to his desk, his mind already calculating damage control strategies. They want proof of stability. Personal stability. What does that mean? Cassian stopped moving. An idea was forming, one that was either brilliant or completely insane. He turned to look at Sylvie, seeing her with new eyes. Professional, composed, unimpeachable reputation. The perfect image of stability. It means, he said slowly, that I need to appear settled, grounded, like someone who has personal relationships that provide emotional support during stressful periods. Sylvie's eyes widened as she began to understand where his thoughts were leading. Cassian, no. Think about it logically. You need $10,000 for Mrs. Chen's treatment. I need someone who can credibly represent stability in my personal life. It's a business arrangement. Marriage is not a business arrangement. It would be for us. Temporary, contractual, no emotional expectations, no romantic complications. Just two people helping each other solve practical problems. Sylvie stared at him as if he'd lost his mind entirely. You're proposing a fake marriage. I'm proposing a solution that benefits both of us. And what happens when the scandal blows over? When Mrs. Chen's treatment is paid for? Do we just divorce and pretend none of this happened? Cassian felt something twist in his chest at the word divorce, but he pushed the feeling aside. We establish parameters, clear boundaries, a timeline. This is insane. This is practical. Sylvie was quiet for a long moment, and Cassian found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. The money you're offering, she said finally. It's not just for Mrs. Chen, is it? It's enough to pay off my student loans, my sister's medical debt, everything. If you want it to be. And all I have to do is pretend to be married to you. All you have to do is be yourself. The woman who's competent, ethical, and completely uninterested in my money for personal gain. Except now I would be interested in your money for personal gain. No, Cassian said quietly. You'd be interested in my money for survival. There's a difference. 3 weeks later, Sylvie stood in the kitchen of Cassian's penthouse at 6:47 a.m., wearing a simple gold band that felt heavier than it should. Mrs. Vale, she said to her reflection in the coffee maker, testing how the name sounded in her mouth. It tasted strange, like a language she was still learning to speak. The civil ceremony had been exactly what Cassian promised. Efficient, emotionless, witnessed by his lawyer and her college roommate, who had agreed to fly in from Chicago without asking too many questions. Sylvie had worn a navy dress she already owned. Cassian had worn the same charcoal suit he wore to board meetings. They had exchanged rings, signed papers, and shaken hands like business partners closing a deal, which, she supposed, was exactly what they were. Good morning. Cassian's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him adjusting his tie with the same precision he brought to everything else. 3 weeks of marriage hadn't changed his morning routine. Up at 6:30, dressed by 6:45, coffee at 6:50. Good morning, she replied, noting that he looked as uncomfortable with their new dynamic as she felt. Your blood pressure medication is on the counter. Thank you. They moved around each other in the kitchen with careful choreography. Two people sharing space without sharing intimacy. It should have been easier than it was. They had established rules. Separate bedrooms, minimal physical contact, except when necessary for public appearances, no discussion of the arrangement in front of others. But the rules hadn't accounted for the way her pulse quickened when he accidentally brushed her hand while reaching for his coffee, or the way she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read when he thought she wasn't looking. "How did your meeting with the board go yesterday?" she asked, settling into the routine of morning conversation that had developed organically between them. Better. The marriage announcement helped with the stability concerns. Cassian paused, cup halfway to his lips. Harrison said the Journal dropped the speculation about my health once they learned I'd gotten married. Apparently, men in committed relationships are statistically less likely to have stress-related breakdowns. Statistics, Sylvie murmured. How romantic. Something flickered in Cassian's expression. Humor, maybe, or irony. Is that what this is missing? Romance? The question caught her off guard, partially because of how it sounded when he said it, and partially because she'd been wondering the same thing. It's missing authenticity, she said finally. When we're in public, we look like strangers pretending to be married. We are strangers pretending to be married. Are we? Sylvie set down her coffee and looked at him directly. Because I know that you have nightmares about your brother. I know that you check your phone every morning hoping Fletcher might have called even though you never answer when he does. I know that you donated $50,000 to the children's hospital where Mrs. Chen is being treated. Not just the $10,000 for her specific care. Cassian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You weren't supposed to find out about the donation. Your accountant called to confirm the tax deduction paperwork. He assumed I knew. They stared at each other across the breakfast bar, the space between them charged with unspoken truths. Why did you say yes? Cassian asked suddenly. To the marriage proposal? To all of it. The monitoring, the living arrangement, the fake marriage. You could have found other ways to pay your debts. Sylvie was quiet for a long moment, considering how much honesty their arrangement could handle. Because you were dying, she said finally. The medical condition wasn't life-threatening. Not the medical condition, the isolation. I've seen what it does to people, the way they start to disappear from their own lives piece by piece until there's nothing left but the functions they perform for other people. Cassian's coffee cup made a soft clink as he set it down. And you thought marrying me would fix that? I thought giving you a reason to care about someone else's well-being might remind you to care about your own, even if that someone doesn't actually care about you. The question hung between them like a challenge, and Sylvie felt something shift in her chest, something dangerous and honest and completely contrary to their carefully negotiated boundaries. Who says I don't care about you? Cassian went very still. Our agreement specifically stated, our agreement was about sexual involvement and romantic expectations. It didn't say anything about caring. Caring is dangerous. More dangerous than what we're doing now? Pretending that living together, sharing meals, falling asleep to the sound of each other's breathing in the next room, pretending that none of that matters? Cassian stood abruptly, moving to the window where Manhattan spread out below them like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. It's not supposed to matter, but it does. Yes, he said quietly, his back still turned to her. It does. Sylvie felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, the moment when their careful arrangement revealed itself to be built on something much more fragile and real than either of them had wanted to acknowledge. Cassian, don't. His voice was rough. Don't make this more complicated than it already is. What if it's supposed to be complicated? He turned to face her, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression that made her breath catch. What if, she continued, we stopped pretending that this is just business? Because, Cassian said, his voice barely above a whisper, if we stop pretending, I might start hoping for something I can't afford to lose. That night, Cassian couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, their bed technically, though they had maintained the fiction of separate rooms, listening to the soft sounds of Sylvie moving through the penthouse. At 2:17 a.m., he heard her footsteps in the hallway. At 2:23, the refrigerator door opening and closing. At 2:31, the soft scrape of a chair being pulled across the kitchen floor. By 2:45, he gave up pretending he could ignore whatever was keeping her awake. He found her sitting at the breakfast bar, still wearing the oversized Columbia Medical School t-shirt she used as pajamas, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had clearly gone cold. Her medical textbook was open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She looked up, startled. "Did I wake you?" "No." He moved to the coffee maker, needing something to do with his hands. "I was already awake." "Nightmares?" The question was gentle, matter of fact, the way she asked about his blood pressure or his stress levels. But there was something different in her tone tonight. Less clinical, more personal. "Not exactly." Cassian leaned against the counter, studying her face in the dim light. "What about you? Medical emergency?" Sylvie closed her textbook and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I got a call from Dr. Pembroke earlier, about Mrs. Chen. Is she all right?" "She's doing well. Better than expected, actually. The treatment is working faster than anyone predicted." Sylvie's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. "He wanted to thank you for the donation." Cassian felt uncomfortable with the gratitude, the way he always did when people tried to make his money into something heroic. It was just money. It was her life. It was a tax write-off. "Stop." Sylvie's voice was sharper than usual, and it made him look at her more closely. "Stop diminishing everything good you do as if caring about people makes you weak." "I didn't say it made me weak. You didn't have to. You do this thing. Whenever someone acknowledges something kind or generous you've done, you find a way to make it about business or strategy or anything, except the fact that you actually give a damn about other people." Cassian felt something defensive rise in his chest. "And what if I do? Give a damn, I mean. What difference does it make?" "It makes all the difference." Sylvie stood, moving closer to him. "It means that everything we've been doing, this marriage, this arrangement, this careful dance around pretending we don't affect each other, it's all been built on a lie." "What lie?" "That you don't know how to love people. That you're incapable of real connection. That you're safer keeping everyone at a distance." The words hit him like physical blows, each one finding a target he'd thought was well protected. "Maybe I am safer at a distance." "Safer for who?" "For everyone." Cassian's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Do you know what happened the last time I let someone matter to me? Really matter?" Sylvie waited, not pushing, just present. "My father," he said finally. "I was 28 when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, they said. I threw everything I had at it. Experimental treatments, clinical trials, the best doctor's money could buy. I managed his care like a military campaign. What happened? He lived 2 years longer than anyone expected. 2 years of surgeries and chemotherapy and medical procedures that probably caused more suffering than they prevented. And at the end, when he was dying anyway, he looked at me and said," Cassian's voice broke slightly, "He said he wished I had spent less time trying to save him and more time just being with him." Sylvie moved closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her shampoo. "So you decided it was easier not to care about anyone." "I decided it was safer not to try to save anyone. But that's not what you did with Mrs. Chen. You didn't try to save her. You just helped her access the care she needed. That's different." "How?" Cassian looked at her, this woman who had somehow become the center of his carefully controlled world, and felt something crack inside his chest. "Because Mrs. Chen was your patient, and He stopped, the words caught in his throat. "And you what?" "And I care about you," he said, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I care about you more than I've cared about anything in years, and it terrifies me." Sylvie went very still. "Cassian, I know it wasn't part of our agreement. I know it complicates everything, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just business, that you're just my doctor, that having you in my life doesn't matter." They stood in the dim kitchen, the space between them electric with possibility and fear. "What are you saying?" Sylvie's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that I want to try. Not the fake marriage, not the arrangement. Something real, something that might actually matter." Sylvie's eyes searched his face, looking for something he hoped she would find. "And what if it doesn't work? What if we mess this up? Then we'll have tried something that mattered more than protecting ourselves." For a moment, he thought she might say yes. He could see something shift in her expression, something open and hopeful and brave. But then her phone rang. She glanced at the display and immediately answered. "Dr. Pembroke? What's wrong?" Cassian watched her face change as she listened, watched professional concern replace personal vulnerability. "When did this happen?" she asked, already moving toward her medical bag. "Yes, I can be there in 20 minutes. She hung up and looked at Cassian with an expression that was part apology, part something else he couldn't identify. "Mrs. Chen is having complications. I have to go. I'll drive you." "No, She stopped, studying his face. Actually, yes. I'd like that. As they dressed quickly and prepared to leave, Cassian felt something settle into place between them. Not resolution exactly, but recognition. They were no longer pretending this was just an arrangement. Whatever happened next, it would be real. The hospital corridors at 3 a.m. felt like a different world. Quieter, more intimate, stripped of the daytime chaos that usually filled these spaces with urgency and noise. Cassian followed Sylvie through the maze of hallways, watching the way she moved with purpose and familiarity through an environment that was foreign to him. This was her world, the place where she belonged, where she made a difference that could be measured in heartbeats and recovery rates and families who got to keep the people they loved. Mrs. Chen is in room 314, Dr. Pembroke said when they reached the cardiac unit. He was a tall, graying man who looked like he'd been awake for too many consecutive hours. Her vitals destabilized around midnight. We've managed to stabilize her, but he glanced at Cassian uncertainly. He can hear this, Sylvie said firmly. What's her status? The treatment appears to have triggered an autoimmune response. Her body is rejecting the very medication that was helping her. We need to adjust the protocol, but that means starting over with a different approach. More expensive, longer treatment cycle, and honestly, less certainty about outcomes. Cassian felt Sylvie go very still beside him. How much more expensive? Another 20,000, potentially more depending on how she responds. I see. Sylvie's voice was professionally neutral, but Cassian could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched slightly at her sides. Dr. Ashford, you should know that the family is considering discontinuing treatment. They're grateful for what you've already made possible, but they can't ask for more help and they can't afford. They're not discontinuing treatment, Cassian said quietly. Both doctors turned to look at him. Whatever the cost is, whatever she needs, handle it. Send the bills to my office. Dr. Pembroke blinked. Mr. Vale, that's incredibly generous. But you don't even know Mrs. Chen. No, Cassian said, his eyes on Sylvie's face. But I know Dr. Ashford. And if she thinks Mrs. Chen deserves a chance, that's enough for me. For a moment, the only sound in the hallway was the distant beep of monitors and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Can we see her? Sylvie asked finally. Mrs. Chen was sleeping when they entered her room, her small frame dwarfed by the hospital bed and the array of machines monitoring her vital signs. Her daughter sat in the chair beside the bed, holding her mother's hand. Dr. Ashford, the daughter, Lily, Cassian remembered from their previous conversations, stood quickly. Thank you for coming so late. I know you didn't have to. Of course I had to, Sylvie said gently, moving to check Mrs. Chen's chart. How is she feeling? Tired, scared, but fighting. Lily looked between Sylvie and Cassian. Dr. Pembroke said there might be additional costs for the new treatment protocol. There won't be any additional costs to your family, Cassian said. Focus on taking care of your mother. Lily's eyes filled with tears. I don't understand. Why would you? You don't even know us. Cassian glanced at Sylvie, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Because Dr. Ashford believes your mother's life is worth fighting for, he said simply. And I've learned to trust her judgment. After they left the hospital, they drove through the empty streets of Manhattan in comfortable silence. It wasn't until they were back in the elevator up to the penthouse that Sylvie finally spoke. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. $20,000, possibly more, for a woman you've never met. Cassian studied their reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls. Two people who looked like they belonged together, who had somehow found their way to something that felt like home. It's not about Mrs. Chen, he said quietly. Then what is it about? The elevator doors opened and they walked into the penthouse together. But instead of going to their separate rooms, they both stopped in the living room, neither quite ready for the night to end. It's about you, Cassian said finally. It's about the fact that you stayed awake worrying about a patient's financial situation. It's about the way you advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves. It's about the fact that you made me remember what it feels like to care about something other than profit margins and market share. Sylvie moved closer to him, her eyes searching his face. And it's about the fact that I'm tired of pretending this is just an arrangement, he continued, his voice rough with honesty. I'm tired of separate bedrooms and professional boundaries and pretending that having you in my life hasn't changed everything about who I am. They were standing close now, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to count her eyelashes if he wanted to. Cassian, she whispered, and there was something in her voice that made his breath catch. Tell me to stop, he said, reaching up to touch her face. Tell me this is still just business and I'll go back to my room and we'll pretend this conversation never happened. Instead of answering, Sylvie placed her hand over his, pressing his palm against her cheek. What if I don't want you to stop? The question hung between them for a heartbeat, and then Cassian was kissing her. Not the careful, controlled kiss of someone trying to maintain distance, but the desperate, honest kiss of someone who had been holding back for too long. Sylvie kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. All the careful boundaries they had constructed, all the professional distance they had maintained, all the pretense that this was just an arrangement, everything dissolved in the space between one heartbeat and the next. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cassian rested his forehead against hers. This changes everything, he said. I know. Our agreement, the marriage, the professional relationship. I know. Are you sure? Sylvie looked at him with eyes that were clear and certain and completely unafraid. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, and for the first time since his father's death, Cassian allowed himself to hope that caring about someone might not destroy him. It might actually save him. 6 months later, the sound of laughter coming from his kitchen was still something Cassian had to get used to. He paused in the doorway of his home office. Their home office now, he corrected himself, noting Sylvie's medical journals stacked neatly beside his pharmaceutical reports, and listened to the conversation happening in the next room. Sylvie was on the phone with Lily Chen, their weekly check-in that had evolved from medical consultations to something closer to friendship. She's doing so well, Sylvie was saying, her voice bright with genuine joy. The new treatment protocol is working better than anyone expected. Dr. Pembroke thinks she'll be ready to go home next week. Cassian smiled, remembering the day 3 weeks ago when Mrs. Chen had finally turned the corner. Sylvie had cried in the hospital hallway, tears of relief and exhaustion and pure, overwhelming gratitude. He had held her while she sobbed, and for the first time in his life, being needed by someone hadn't felt like a burden. Tell her I'll stop by tomorrow, Sylvie continued. And Lily, you don't have to keep thanking me. Taking care of people is what I do. When she hung up, Cassian found her standing at the kitchen window, looking out at Central Park, where autumn was painting the trees in shades of gold and red. She was wearing one of his old Columbia t-shirts and a pair of jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked nothing like the composed professional woman who had first walked into his penthouse 6 months ago, and everything like home. Good news? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. The best news. Mrs. Chen gets to go home to her garden and her terrible soap operas and her daughter's terrible cooking. Sylvie leaned back against his chest. How was your call with Fletcher? The weekly phone calls with his brother were still complicated, still sometimes frustrating, but they were happening. That alone felt like a miracle. He's thinking about moving to Portland. Says he wants to try something new, maybe get into sustainable farming. Cassian rested his chin on top of Sylvie's head. I told him if he's serious, I'll help him find a program. That's wonderful. We'll see. Fletcher's gotten serious about a lot of things over the years. But this time you're not writing him off before he's even started. It was true. Something had shifted in Cassian's ability to hope for his brother, to believe that people could change and grow and surprise you with their capacity for better choices. He suspected Sylvie had something to do with that shift. The board meeting went well, he said, changing the subject. They approved the new accessibility initiative. Sylvie turned in his arms, her eyes bright with interest. All of it? All of it. Subsidized medications for low-income patients, expanded clinical trial access, partnerships with community health centers. Cassian tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Harrison thinks I've gone soft. Have you? Completely. She laughed, the sound filling the space between them with warmth. Good. Soft looks good on you. They had been married for real now for 2 months. A small ceremony in the hospital chapel where Mrs. Chen was being treated, witnessed by Lily and Dr. Pembroke, and a handful of other people who had become their chosen family. Sylvie had worn a simple white dress that she'd bought at a department store. Cassian had worn the same suit from their first wedding, but this time when he'd said, I do, he'd meant it with every fiber of his being. I have something to show you, Sylvie said, pulling away from him with a mysterious smile. She led him to the dining room table where she had spread out architectural drawings, detailed plans for what looked like a medical facility. What is this? A proposal for a community health center in Queens, specializing in behavioral health services for underserved populations. Sylvie's voice carried the same excited energy he'd seen when she talked about challenging cases or breakthrough treatments. I want to leave the private practice world. I want to do something that matters. Cassian studied the drawings, noting the careful attention to detail, the way the space was designed to feel welcoming rather than clinical. This would be expensive to start up. I know. That's why it's just a proposal right now. A dream, really. How expensive? Sylvie named a figure that would have seemed astronomical to most people, but felt perfectly reasonable to Cassian when weighed against the light in her eyes as she talked about it. Consider it funded, he said simply. Cassian, you can't just... I can do whatever I want with my money, and what I want is to watch you change the world, one patient at a time. Sylvie stared at him, and he saw the exact moment she realized he was completely serious. You would do that? Fund an entire medical center because I asked? I would do that because it matters to you, and what matters to you matters to me. Cassian pulled her closer, marveling at how natural it felt to say the words. Besides, I've learned something important over the past few months. What's that? That the best investments aren't the ones that make the most money. They're the ones that make the most difference. Later that evening, as they lay in bed, in their bedroom, with their life spread out around them in the form of shared books and medical journals and coffee mugs that never quite made it back to the kitchen, Sylvie traced lazy patterns on Cassian's chest. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly, giving up the careful distance, the emotional control, the safety of not caring about anyone. Cassian thought about the question seriously. His life was messier now, more complicated. He worried about Mrs. Chen's recovery, about Fletcher's next phone call, about whether Sylvie was happy, about whether he was capable of being the partner she deserved. His heart rate was probably less stable than it had been 6 months ago, but his actual heart, the metaphorical one he'd spent years protecting, felt stronger than it ever had. Never, he said finally. Do you regret agreeing to that fake marriage proposal from a control-freak billionaire who didn't know the difference between being needed and being loved? Never, she replied without hesitation, though I should probably mention that I knew the difference from the beginning. What do you mean? I mean, I never thought you didn't know how to love people, Cassian. I thought you were afraid to let yourself be loved by them. The observation settled into him like a truth he'd been avoiding for years. And now I think you've figured out that being loved doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave enough to love back. Outside their bedroom window, Manhattan pulsed with its endless rhythm of life and possibility. Somewhere in the city, Mrs. Chen was sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed, counting down the days until she could go home. Somewhere else, Fletcher was probably staying up too late, planning his next fresh start with the kind of optimism that used to annoy Cassian, but now just made him hopeful. And here, in this bed, in this life they had built from what had started as a business arrangement, Cassian felt something he had never expected to feel, completely, perfectly at peace. Sylvie? Thank you. For what? For seeing who I could be before I knew it myself. She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes soft with love and contentment and the kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where you belong. Thank you for letting me stay long enough to watch you become him. As they drifted off to sleep, Cassian's last conscious thought was that he had spent his entire adult life learning to control his heart rate, never realizing that the most important thing was simply learning to let his heart beat for someone else. What would you choose if love knocked down every wall you'd built to protect yourself? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.